My name's Ed Cabrera. I'm the Chief Cybersecurity Officer for Trend Micro. Been at Trend for about 3 years. Before that, I spent 20 years with the U.S. Secret Service. I'm a bit of a pacer, so I'll be walking and talking. At Secret Service, I held many different roles, from our cyber forensics lead, our network intrusion responder lead, but also working as our deputy CISO and CISO there. A little bit about Trend. Trend's been around 30 years. We turned 30 this year. Started as a regular AV company, and it's essentially a holistic cybersecurity solutions provider from endpoint, network, and cloud. What I'm going to talk about today, because we do a lot of research, we've got about 450 threat and vulnerability researchers around the globe. And I almost want to say that we sort of crowdsource our own threat intelligence as well. And we do that, but it's one of those things when we were talking about coming to present here, we were talking about unique areas where crowdsourcing definitely provides a value to cybersecurity. It's definitely been around in some aspects for a while, but I'm going to sort of cover what it really looks like and what it should look like. So the problem, obviously you cannot pick up a paper. I don't think anybody picks up papers anymore. Your laptop, your phone, desktop, no. So without seeing some kind of news story around the latest data breach, right? Gemalto puts out biannual reports similar to the Verizon data breach report on what's really the state of data breaches. And in the first half, had over 3 billion records compromised. So it's pretty almost desensitizing the way how much we hear about records being compromised and being a part of some large breach. But the statistics here is pretty interesting. Healthcare is the top one. Not surprising, because the type of data with healthcare is a very rich and complete data set that includes financial, health, physical, you name the type of data all in one record, right? Traditional PII could be very loose bits of pieces of information. Health records are really complete. So the next one actually was 19% was other. Well, sort of skews those numbers. The next one is actually financial sector, which is not surprising, right? From a perspective of when you're looking at data or a sector that is attacked, financial has been attacked for many, many years, obviously physically, and then in cyber. And then you have education. Not surprising, large amounts of data, exposed and not really providing or having that security around it. The report talks about 56% of the data of those that were compromised were malicious outsiders, right? And then the 34% represented the accidental loss. For many years, the accidental loss really outpaced the malicious outsider number for quite some time. And so now we've reached a level of cyber activity that it's truly there. So talking about breaches, all right, we talk about Equifax. Now we talk about Facebook. Cathay Pacific was breached, 9.4 million records that came out in the news this morning. So it is here, and it's here to stay, right? The much more connected we are, personally but professionally, the type of data that's out there that can be easily monetized, or maybe not easily monetized at times, is a huge value within the criminal underground. So when you talk about the responsibility when it comes to this problem, right? It's an international problem. Often people think, well, you know what? It's law enforcement. They're not arresting and targeting individuals that are behind these crimes. That's not the case. Law enforcement is doing it. It's just a delayed gratification. It could take 5 years plus from identification of a group, an individual behind a certain breach, until they actually, we in law enforcement terms, we used to say the habeas corpus, when we used to be able to arrest them. And oftentimes with cyber, then it's the extradition piece. So the other piece is private industry. Private industry is probably one of the when it comes to crime, it sort of turns it on its head, right? In the physical world, nobody blames a bank for having glass windows or doors, right, when they're breached or when they're attacked. Cyber blame really goes completely on the private industry side, saying, hey, you're not protecting the data well enough. You're not doing a good enough job. So private industry, are they responsible? I don't know about that. And then obviously government, right? Everybody who likes regulation, wants more regulation, thinks that governments can do a better job of mandating security, cybersecurity at all levels in government and private industry. But I would say it's really all the above, right? You can't do or solve this problem by approaching it from one area alone, right? So when we talk about this public-private partnership, it's sort of cut off. You look at one of the things that, looking and doing research on some of the things that we were doing and sort of finding other areas of commonality, because, the public-private partnership has been around for quite some time, right? When you look at physical crime and cyber crime, the partnership has been critical going forward to do a lot of the work that we do, from the prevention all the way to the law enforcement and supporting them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The one thing I wanted to, when I was doing research, I was looking at seeing how is it, what can we look to sort of make that analogy. So, see if the video works. Not this one just yet. But it's basically collective intelligence. The idea behind it is collective intelligence. How do we truly streamline collective intelligence? But I wanted to show this video. I'm getting ahead of myself. Collective intelligence is the ideal. And the one area that I always look at from our perspective is, well, who's doing this collective intelligence well? Well, for the last 10 plus years, it's been essentially the Russian criminal underground. The Russian criminal underground has been doing crowdsourcing cybercrime for many years. And the reason why that happened was, if you go back to the mid-1990s, you had Amazon and eBay really create e-commerce for us, right, that we enjoy. Well, during that time, I always laugh and say, okay, you have Silicon Valley being really, bringing us technology-wise. I would say Eastern Europe became, Crimicon Valley, because at that same moment, you had a convergence of geopolitical factors, geoeconomic factors, but also you had disruptive technology happen. And what I mean is that fall of the Soviet Union, you had a high level or a large group of highly technical individuals out of work. You had that coupled with many countries within the post-Soviet Union era are used to a black market economies, and then you add in this globalization of the internet from a technology perspective. So this whole perfect cyber storm created this area of, or parallel universe where, we enjoy reputation economies right now on the surface web, right? We don't buy any product. We don't buy it from any suppliers or vendors unless we actually look at how they're rated, right? That goes into everything that we do. The Russian criminal underground has been doing that for quite some time, but instead of rating products directly, you're basically looking at how these individuals are rating themselves as criminals. So they've been able to really change this whole landscape because they've been able to scale trust. The panel talked about trust, and I'm sure it's going to be here for the next 2 days when you talk about crowdsourcing trust. They have been able to, in the last 10 to 15 years, to really scale trust. You've taken these cyber criminals, when you look at them, it's different from your regular organized criminal groups. They operate from different motivations. Traditional organized crime operate with fear, intimidation, and violence. I mean, greed is the common denominator. But within the cyber criminal undergrounds, specifically Russian criminal undergrounds, it's more about the FOMO principle, the fear of missing out, right? They are really motivated because of the fact of the money that they're able to make within the criminal underground, and that if they get ostracized, they get kicked out, then they know they're not going to be able to live the lifestyle that they can, or that they have been doing. So they've really been, sadly enough, in cybersecurity, probably one of the best examples on how you could crowdsource anything. But this is where, unfortunately, they're much better and much farther along than us on the good side of scaling trust, creating the partnerships, and being able to do that sharing of information at the technical level, but at the human level as well. So how do they do it? Well, they're able to communicate and collaborate very well. You have, it was started out in the early 2000s, the IRC chat rooms, which still happens today, but what has grown within the criminal underground is these pretty elaborate transactional forms where they're able to come and pretty much communicate and collaborate almost at a very high automated level. So the other thing that I mentioned is trust, right? How do they do the trust? Instead of, say, cyber crime, or rather regular crime, you have street cred, right? Within a group or a series of groups, you have that street cred. Well, you have to build a reputation on the cyber criminal underground, and that's cyber cred. And the way they do that, they have a level of anonymity, pseudo-anonymity, because they operate with nicknames when they do this. But they have to brag and they have to showcase their wares, right, within the criminal underground. It's great for law enforcement. Unfortunately, when you have to tie it, that true identity to a nick is usually that longer, it takes a little bit of time for law enforcement to make that connection. They work in pods and cells, very similar to the tech industry. The analogy is there, like I said, Crimicon Valley. They have essentially create cells that it's a meritocracy. They come together based on the skills that they have and what value they can bring to the group. And it's very temporal. They come together, do a campaign of attacks to where they can monetize, and they can either stay together or move on to other groups. They enjoy physical safe havens, right? They operate oftentimes in Russia specifically, but also other countries that do not have extradition treaties with the United States. So they're able to operate in these safe havens, and fortunately for us, they like to spend a lot of the money that they make within the criminal underground, and they usually travel to very friendly third-party countries. But the result over the last 10, 15 years has been this really very mature marketplace. We talk in terms in our industries, they've created this crime as a service model. They are providing end-to-end services to other less capable, less connected cyber criminals. So they've created this huge marketplace where they compete with each other for other criminal business. And instead of a B2B model, it's a C2C model. So, well, I jumped. So, what does the actionable intelligence for the good guys look like? You know what, I want to make sure that we didn't skip this is the video I wanted to show. Let's see if it comes up. I know we were having issues before with videos. Now, let me go back this way. It was on that slide. There you go. So it threw me off. I knew it was in there. My timing was off. But when I started looking at
collective behavior
some of the
is all around
analogies to what we need to do in cybersecurity,
we see bird flocks, fish schools, animal herds, And what really defines these systems is that there's no global orchestrating power. The individual units are locally communicating with each other, and yet remarkably through these types of communication we get animal groups being able to synchronize their motion and respond to predators in a way that we just couldn't possibly imagine. We're still fairly bad at predicting collective behaviors, and one of the reasons is that there are many emergent properties that you don't necessarily expect based on the individual components. And that's why many of these systems, even relatively simple organizations like schools of fish, are so mysterious to us. Schooling fish have become a very powerful organism for us because, like all other vertebrates, they have to solve many challenges. They live in a dangerous environment that's unpredictable, and they have to take in this complex sensory information and translate that into movement controls. And we don't really understand how these organisms do that. When we observe animals like schooling fish, often their responses to each other are extremely fast. It's like a blur when we watch it. But if we use modern technologies like high-speed video, we can slow time down. We can track the motion of individuals hundreds of times per second, and we can then use computational techniques to understand how each individual takes in this complex sensory information and then translates that to movement decisions in, fractions of a second.
You're scared of something here, eh?
Yeah, exactly. That gives us, for the very first time, the data we need to try to understand how the emergent collective behavior arises from the interactions among the individual components of the system.
So that was sort of, had to go back. But that was like the best video, and I have the second part at the end if we have time, where it was probably the best analogy I wanted to come up with is what we need to get to from a technology perspective and how we're getting there, but also from even the people side of the house. It is this whole notion of swarming and the idea of how could you essentially do crowdsourcing at the technology level, but at the human level and the group level. Because I think it's really telling here, and he talks about it, the second part, on basically that these individuals, especially from the swarming research perspective, and they were showing the starlings, is the fact that they don't need to know and they don't need to communicate with everybody within that group. All they're doing is taking information in from the seven, I think it was the seven, here it's fish, but also the starling was seven birds around them, right? If they just had to communicate at a very local level, and then they'd be able to move as a group. So it was one of those things that I looked at as like what we're trying to do and we'll be trying to do in cybersecurity for quite some time. So I sort of jumped there. And then what we did, in a way, we're still working with this. We partnered with HITRUST. They're an information sharing analysis organization in healthcare. And with one of our products, our deep discovery product, we were able to do a 3-month study to identify how, if anything, that we can do to improve threat information sharing in cybersecurity. It's a huge challenge because for threat information sharing in cybersecurity, it's all about time and context. That if it's too late, then it's no good, and if there's not enough context, it's no good. So how do you do it at speed with context? And so what we did, they had about 808, let's say that. We took 8 of their members. They have a cyber threat exchange group within their membership. And we provisioned 8 of them with our breach detection box, which is not meant for information sharing. We just wanted to sort of see if we could identify indicators of a compromise sooner and if we could share them sooner. And in that 3-month period, we wanted to see, okay, how does that compare to the 800 others that weren't participating? And it was pretty interesting because similar to that video, we were able to identify IOCs within minutes or seconds, and we were able to share almost that much quicker. But just even the volume alone, during that 3-month period, we identified 21,000 indicators of a compromise. And an indicator of a compromise, it could be a hash, it could be a malicious domain, a hash of a malware, it could be anything that relates to a particular attack. And so 8 of them identified 21,000. The 800 only identified 14,000. And to me, I think what was really interesting, so the volume is key, because right now the threat intelligence information sharing model is almost, it's a one-to-many, and I'll show here in a second. But we were able to say it's 100% healthcare IOCs, and we were able to beat by up to 7 weeks of threat intelligence providers, right? So there's companies out there in our industry that sell threat intelligence. So they collect it, process it, maybe even do some contextual information, analysis, and then they share it. Well, we were able to identify these IOCs with real campaigns in the healthcare, and we beat them by like 7 weeks. So it's that whole notion that, is it possible, especially in cybersecurity, we're always talking about, can you get to machine-to-machine threat intelligence information sharing? And we proved it, right, with this particular study. So, as the analogy goes, we had 8 fish as opposed to the 800. We're much more effective and much more resilient in this study to do that. So it's the spoke versus mesh, right? Again, this is the whole notion of crowdsourcing as well, right? The spoke is one-to-many, and the model, unfortunately, does not work. It's not fast enough, especially the scope and scale of attacks that we're seeing. So this is the difference. And so this is where we get into the notion of, well, can you do crowdsourcing to improve threat intelligence information sharing? And from a technical level, absolutely. How do you go beyond, say, a study like this? A little harder, but I think it's something that we can achieve, right? So the other piece is the human side. And the human side we've been doing for quite some time as far as a company, but also the industry has been doing this quite some time. And that's doing it from our research perspective. So what we do, we have, like I mentioned, 450 threat researchers, but we also have about 30 individuals that are doing criminal underground work for us. In other words, they're not only understanding what the underground looks like, but as they identify criminal activity, they're able to identify individuals. And so they end up working with the FBI, the Secret Service, to provide that technical expertise to take it down. So here, this was back in 2011. It was part of Operation Ghost Click. 6 Estonian individuals were arrested. And Ghost Click was basically a group that was utilizing DNS changer malware. And what that was doing was they were infecting millions of machines. And with this malware, they were compromising the domain name service records in such a way that they were redirecting these individuals to advertisement. So that click fraud, so to speak, they were legitimately going after advertising, click fraud, and being able to make a profit out of there. Obviously, you could see the ideas and the opportunities to do much more than that with this particular piece. So we were able to take them down. And then we also were, Spy Eye was a pretty prolific key logging, credential stealing malware that was hitting pretty much the globe. We were able to work with law enforcement to take this individual down, and that was Alexander Panin. I'm pronouncing his name wrong. But in any event, a success rate. So when we talk about crowdsourcing in cybersecurity, it's not just the technical piece, it's the human piece. How can we collectively to work to each other? How can we trust each other? How can we get things done? This is a picture of the director of NCA, the National Crime Agency, and then may he rest in peace, my former boss, he was the CTO. But just showing that the cooperation, the trust, collaboration is critical that we need to do on our side. So some of the law enforcement agencies that we work with internationally on cases to try to do our part, pretty extensive. So what is needed? How do you do it? And again, that formula is pretty simple, but sometimes it's easier said than done. You need to be able to engage, and from a cybersecurity perspective, is engaging law enforcement. You're engaging certs. You're engaging individuals within your sectors and information sharing analysis centers or analysis organizations. And then the biggest thing is the trust piece. That's the one thing we have. We have a trust deficit that is incredible on our side between government, private industry, and law enforcement. So it's the trust. How can we do that? And the best way to do that is to build these relationships ahead of time. Don't wait for the bad things to happen. Really, there's been this notion of task forces that have been around for quite some time in law enforcement, and in cyber, the FBI and the Secret Service have task forces. It's joining these groups to enable or build trust. And then lastly, share, right? And sharing it in a model that you can trust that it will be used correctly, not abused, but sharing is critical. You do it through existing programs or more formal programs with government and with each other. So that's my last one, and I don't know if I have time, but I can show that last 2-minute piece of the video if you wanted to.
Well, we're running out of time, but I'd love to, yeah. Thank you very much.
All right.
Appreciate that.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Thank you. Yeah.